Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek.
Well, hi everyone. I am Kenlee Anderson. I am a psychology intern, and I've recently started working with the fabulous Natasha Helfer. And this is her podcast where we attack shame and get healthier through education, stories, and relationships.
Awesome. Thank you, Kenlee. That's kind of fun that you're introducing me.
I know. It's fun, right? Boy, that was awesome. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah. So, I've done kind of like Ask a Sex Therapist podcast before, but then I just do them all solo and lonely, and then I just talk to myself, and then I think it's kind of boring. So it's kind of nice when you have somebody else to shoot the breeze with in regards to all these topics. So
seriously.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I wanted to bring you on because we keep getting this. I keep seeing it in our social media messages. And before I say anything about the messages, I just want to let everyone and we have got consent to share these stories anonymously. But it's a question and a topic that keeps coming up, and we see it time and time again. I just want to get your thoughts and feedback about it. And that is, after leaving a high-demand religion, parents seem to struggle with how to talk about sex education with their children or young adults. Because, as you know, in a high-demand religion, the basic thing that's taught is just abstinence, or whatever else is taught. But there's not really any education around how to talk to your children about sex and consent and what is appropriate, what isn't appropriate, these type of things. And we've got a lot of questions coming in on social media about your opinion in regards to that and how to navigate, especially after leaving, how to navigate some of those things that maybe we even ourselves as parents feel are triggering, like we were never taught those things. So now how do we talk to our kids about it?
Yeah, no, I think whether you leave a high demand religion or not, it's always hard to talk to your kids about sex because most of us don't come from systems that offered that kind of frankness or openness, and even I think when people do come from fairly sex positive backgrounds, because they are rare, they still have so much cultural influence around them, right, by their peers or the media or whatever, that most people are dealing with kind of a heaping pile of crapola when it comes to sexual information and feelings and relationship dynamics and all the things, right? Which is
so true. It's funny that you say that, because I've tried to have an open dialogue with my kids for many years, but then I get a lot of grief from people that are like, you're way too open with your children. And I'm like, they're hearing it in school. They're either going to hear it in school and hear it the wrong way, or they're going to hear it from me. But half the time, I don't even know what I'm talking about, because I feel like, what's too much information? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't even know how to have this conversation with my children because I don't know. Am I giving them more information than even I should be sharing? I don't know.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So I think, and all of this breeds sexual shame. And sexual shame is probably the number one interrupter of sexual pleasure, right? And sexual drive and desire, along with some other things that can be happening too, like biology and hormones and things. But sexual shame is by all means, definitely a very large reason why so many people cannot relax and enjoy both sexual behaviors and also just their own sexual identities, right? So I think we'll dive into a little bit of that and what the difference is. But I thought maybe we'd start with just talking about, kind of like you said, what is the education that most of us get. And as we're going to talk about high demand religions in general, and I know a lot of people who listen to me, come from like some tradition in Mormonism, but there's also others who listen, whether it's Catholicism, evangelicalism, and some of the even Pentecostals. Like there's a lot of religions out there that I would say are fairly prohibitive in their approaches to human sexuality. And at least in today's day, still expect kind of some standards of human sexuality that are not horribly realistic, nor do they follow kind of a normal developmental stage process, right? Because
Right.
I think a lot of people want to assume that, oh, I can just, I can just teach my kid not to be sexual until a special time and place, which usually in these communities means there will be a heterosexual marriage that takes place. And then at that point, my child can go on and be sexual. But even then, we don't have in these communities comprehensive education that starts at marriage. It's just kind of like, oh, now there's this green light. And that, even in some high demand religions, it's not even really a great green light there, because some high demand religions are very procreative focused, and the sexual act can be seen as just a necessary evil. I don't think that's the case in the tradition I come from, the Latter-day Saint or Mormon tradition. I think that there were messages that said, sexuality is to be used to bond with your partner. So at least there was that sense that, it wasn't just for making babies. At the same time, even that kind of general idea means that the only purpose sexuality has is a coupled role with another person, and that ignores the entire individual developmental journey that a person has with their own sexuality from a very usually young age.
Yeah.
So whether it's crushes, whether it's feelings, whether it's masturbation, whether it's gender identity, a lot of these things are showing up at very young ages, 2, 3, 4, 5, as kids kind of negotiate their own bodies and negotiate their own feelings and ideas. And when we just say, pause on all that until you're 19 or 21 or 25, however old you're going to be when you get married, then you're missing this tremendous opportunity, right? Tremendous opportunity to help people develop in sexually healthy ways. So
Yeah, I know that, especially when it came to, well, I was always a very sexual person growing up. And it was always, I was like the troublemaker in the neighborhood, because I was deemed as somebody who had a high sex drive or was promiscuous or whatever it was, right? And it was just never talked about. And I'm coming from my own experience as a young child, having these urges, having these desires. I didn't talk about self pleasure. I mean, that was nothing that I ever discussed. And and so I think, and I grew up predominantly part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That wasn't something that I think even my parents would have known how to really navigate having a conversation with me about those. It was just like, it was this really brushed over, dusted topic of like, oh, yes, that's what happens, and we wait. I mean, it was like, there was a whole lot of in between that we could have talked about, but it was just like, put a period on it. We're going to be done with that sentence. We just wait.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so now as a parent and, stepping back from the church, it's like, well, if that's all I was ever taught, now how am I supposed to help my children? Like you're talking through these really important developmental stages, talk about their sexual health when I was never, I can't, I can't do something I've never experienced myself. So,
right.
so like, what is your advice on having those intimate conversations with your children?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is a really kind of sore spot for many of us who are currently parenting, because of what you just said. It's not like we experienced positive sexual education for the most part. And so then to have to not only deconstruct so much about what we think in regards to our sexuality, but then to figure out a way to talk to kids about it
Mhm.
is very, very difficult. And I feel like working with post Mormon folks and post high demand religious folks, that just doing their own work is so challenging, right? To just
Yeah.
challenge this idea that maybe I can touch my own body, to, as a grown adult, right? Or that my partner has the right to touch their own body without me monitoring what they're thinking about while they do that, or even what they're viewing while they do that. And that maybe my partner has a right to their own autonomy as a sexual individual within the constructs of their own brain and body, right? That is so challenging. or to start thinking about fantasies, or to start thinking about things that I used to think were naughty, but I'd really like to try, right? Or just to consider your orientation or your gender identity differently. I mean, just from an adult perspective, like if you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, which is primarily the population I work with, this is like intense work people are doing in my office. So
Wow.
now imagine if it's so intense to do all that kind of deconstructive work as an adult being with yourself.
Yeah.
Now you've got your littles, and that can range from like a 2-year-old that you're potty training to, a 17-year-old that you're wondering if they've become sexually active with, a partner. That the anxiety is tenfold what you're experiencing for yourself, right? Because now you're in that role of protector and guider, and we have been given a very strict parenting paradigm that we are to protect our children by making sure they do not explore their sexuality. That's the
Yeah.
worst thing that our children could do,
Yeah.
to the point of even comparing it to murder in the LDS doctrine. And when you look at the pamphlet for youth in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints kind of materials, and you read the expectations in regards to sexual standards, basically the idea is that in order to be worthy and righteous, I mean, you can't even be arousing yourself or thinking about things. And we're really like projecting this, you need to be an asexual person until we deem it correct to then turn your sexuality on somehow magically when you get married, and then you can be a sexual being.
Yeah.
That even causes problems for asexual folks, quite frankly, because asexuality is not considered valid within these cultures. It's seen as something that should be temporary and then turned on. And that can be very confusing too, and shameful for people who are asexual, even though they may not be having as much of a hard time following all the standards. There's still this expectation that they know somewhere in their gut and their bones that they're supposed to become sexual at some point, and that can cause a lot of discomfort. So no matter where you are on the spectrum of sexuality, you are this kind of approach is just so unhelpful. So unhelpful.
Truly is. It truly is. Growing up, I remember, I mean, somebody was going to get married and then they had their announcements go out and they're going to get married in the temple. And then suddenly they're not getting married in the temple. I mean, that you just threw like scarlet letter all over them. It was immediately assumed, oh, well, something sexual has happened. And it was never like, it wasn't ever a positive thing. It was always this negative thing associated with it, right? So here you are, you're trying to navigate all these feelings. It's really negative, like, oh, I can't do that, can't do that, can't do that, can't do that. You're trying, and you have all these desires and you have all these urges, and then I do, you exchange some vows over an altar, and then boom, all of a sudden it's fate. And it's just
Yeah.
there's like nothing in between. I do remember there was one teacher in Young Women's when I was going, she gave a lesson. And in the lesson, it was the first time, and I was an instructor, like a leader in the group. It was the first time ever in Young Women's where I had heard this taught, and she said in the lesson, these feelings of being aroused, these feelings of wanting to be close to your partner or to, whoever, they're natural. And I literally dropped my pencil. Like I'm like, wait, what? Like someone's actually saying that? I just wanted to start slow clapping. But in all the years that I've attended, I had only heard that said once, and it was as a leader. So I feel like the culture of being able to talk to our children and being able to do that in a productive and healthy way, we just have a gap of knowledge of how to do that and how to navigate it post
Yeah.
religion.
Yeah. No, and I love hearing the outlier stories of the leaders who do share something more profound than what's found in kind of like the lesson materials. At the same time, they're far and few between. And even though that's a lovely thought, right? Like arousal is a natural thing, we're not talking to anybody about what to do with it, how to manage it, how to think about it, what
Right.
it means, Right. So here's this one sentence that everybody's like, wait, what did sister so and so say? Oh my goodness. But then how do you integrate it, especially when you're getting so many more constant messages that you are integrating by this time in ways
Okay.
that really, hinder, again, your sexual development. I think most of us have arrested sexual development because we were not encouraged. So yes, I think the big fear for a parent, especially if they're deconstructing from religion, is, well, so we were at one extreme over here, right? Don't do anything, the abstinence approach, don't think about it, don't do it, don't touch your own body, don't look at materials that are, erotic or arousing. So then they're like, well, then do I just go way over here? Like, what's the opposite approach? And
And
am
this
I
is this is
supposed
it's
to?
exactly, I'm so glad you're bringing this up, because this is one of the questions that parents are struggling with, because they're like, even my own, as a parent, even your own pendulum swings so far, and they're saying exactly what you just said, which is like, okay, I've been so strict. Do I just say go have sex with everyone and everything's on the table, and you can just, I mean, your wild days are here, but like, how do you, yeah, like, what do you suggest
Right.
there?
Right. So I think that's really the issue. And I think just like it takes a minute to get an education yourself, it's going to take a minute to develop kind of a curriculum, if you want to call it that, of what you want to teach your children. And I think the first thing that I think most of us have heard by now, I hope, is that the sex talk is not a one and done talk, right? Like this idea that we're going to sexually educate our children, that we're going to be emotional, intelligence teachers to our children, that we're going to teach them about academics. It's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing thing, right? It's not a one and done. Oh, phew, I did the sex talk, I'm done. And now I can check that off my list and
I
not
read
never
the book.
feel
Where did
that.
I come from? And we're done.
There was a sperm and there was an egg, and that's all you're ever going to hear from your mom. So anyway, yeah, so I think what I'd like to do is I'd like to start with some basic principles of what comprehensive sexual education covers. A lot of this is informed by Planned Parenthood, which, regardless of how you feel about Planned Parenthood in regards to kind of the issues around abortion, Planned Parenthood is much bigger than that. And they're one of the largest sexual education forces out there. And they have a lot of really great resources and information. I think it's a resource everybody should know about and be grateful for, because there are not a lot of places where you can find accurate, comprehensive sexual education. Believe it or not, I think we're doing better. But even today, in today's, I believe the statistic is about 2 or 3 years old, but even here in the United States, they did an overview of all the sexual education courses throughout the United States. And I think they found 18 states out of the 50 where they actually passed the test that everything they were teaching the kids was actually accurate.
Oh, wow.
18 out of 50. So you want to really be careful with what information you're actually listening to, talking to people about. There's a lot of misinformation out there.
Yeah.
Just one that comes to mind is like porn is the new drug or something like that, right? So you can find a lot of information that sounds so legitimate, that sounds so real, that sounds like the people really know what they're talking about, and it is inaccurate information. And so there's a lot of bias out there, and it's a hard come by to come into this. So you have to educate yourself. I mean, that's the number one thing as a parent, is you're gonna have to educate yourself. You can no longer do the autopilot technique, which we did in these high demand religions, where we just plucked our kids into the church and we let the church kind of educate them. And it was nice and easy, and it was all very organized and correlated. And you had all these materials you could share with them. Now it's kind of like homeschooling. You're going to have to do a lot of that work yourself and really find the resources that you can trust. So anyway, so going back to some of these kind of basic topics, and then we'll kind of cover more specific questions. But one of the things that I want you to think about when it comes to comprehensive sexual education is just normal human development. And some of this many of us did get education on, like how do we reproduce? How do we make babies? But it's much more than that. What happens during puberty? How is your body changing? What are you noticing? Just in this last month, oh, I have to hold my temple for a minute. I'm sorry. Just in this last month, I spoke to 3 different women who told me that they did not know what was happening to them when they got their periods. 3, just in my practice alone.
Wow.
And and one of them was quite emotionally distraught and
Yeah, you think you were.
crying in my office and telling me, what do you think a 10-year-old or an 11-year-old is thinking when blood is coming out of her vagina? You're
Yeah,
thinking, I'm
terrifying.
dying.
Yeah, this is it. This is my last day.
There's something so wrong that I must be dying.
Yeah.
And especially if you're cramping and don't understand what cramps are. I've had men tell me they were kind of weirded out or scared the first time they had a wet dream. I've had men tell me they didn't understand what was happening to their penises during first erections. If you don't
Wow.
explain to people what's happening to their bodies, these changes can be very scary, confusing, feel weird. Maybe your peers are talking about it in a way that's usually silly or graphic or crass, and now you're developing a relationship with your body where you feel like your body's doing something strange or dirty or weird.
Mm-hmm.
We have to start with basic biology and puberty, and a part of human development is also helping kids understand sexual orientation and their gender identity. And again, we live in a world where even sometimes post-religion, it can be very easy and simplistic to still stay in a very heteronormative space and to stay in what, I'm going to use 2 words that are probably not as common for people, but amatonormative spaces, which means that everybody should want to fall in love, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody should want to do that, just like everybody should be heterosexual, right?
Yeah.
And then allonormativity is this idea that, well, and everyone wants to have sex, right? Eventually, everybody's going to want to have sex. So we just come with these ideas about life and humans like it's a given.
Yeah.
It's a given that you want romance. It's a given that you want sex. And it's a given that you're probably heterosexual. And boy, is that not the human experience. That is not the human experience. And so when you have little kids even, right? I mean, I've seen this at so many family reunions, at so many gatherings, you little 5-year-old girls, people who are presenting as girls, as 5-year-olds. Oh, honey, who's your boyfriend?
Oh.
Who do you think is a cute boy?
Do you
Right?
have somebody at school you have a crush on? Yeah.
Exactly, right? And you have a crush, right? Because of course everybody has a crush, right? That's that
Yeah.
amatonormativity that
Right.
we're giving to a 5-year-old, right?
Yeah.
And so right off the
Who
bat,
maybe likes to dig in the dirt and has given it no thought to any boys, but now she's like, or anything of crushes, boy, girl, whatever. And now she's like, wait, I'm supposed to.
hmm,
I guess I have to start looking.
yeah, and there are many kids who are very tuned into their gender identity and their sexual orientation at very young ages. 3, 4, 5. They already have a sense that something is off from what this culture is expecting from me.
Yeah.
And we can see, great gravity of symptoms in these kids, because you can imagine what that must feel like, right? To be in a world that revolves in a way that is so different than what you're experiencing in your own lived body. And so anyway, I think this is one of the things that we want to be thinking about: human development, helping kids understand, yes, you were born with a vagina. Yes, you were born with a penis, and that's your anatomy. And maybe we can also talk about gender. A lot of adults still don't understand the difference between gender and sex.
Yes.
Right? So when you say, okay, yes, your body has a vagina, your body has a penis, and then there's the intersex kids who may have something that doesn't resemble completely a penis or a vulva, and And of course, we have done great atrocities in this country to intersex folks because then we surgically, quote unquote, fix parts of their body that didn't need fixing,
Mhm.
only to make society and parents comfortable with this little person's body who had to fit into this binary, right, of boy or girl, because otherwise, how are we gonna how are we gonna raise this kid? And I don't want to be too harsh on parents because I think parents themselves are in a culture where they're super afraid for their kid. If my kid doesn't fit into that binary, they're going to be bullied, they're going to be teased, they're not going to be seen as normal. They don't want that for their kid, right? So even though these are kind of horrible things we've done, it comes from protective spaces. And I think it's important to have empathy for that. But quite frankly, we've been mutilating people's genitals. That's what we've been doing so that they fit the social norm of binary folks. So then you talk about gender, right? And you're like, yeah, so gender is kind of like whether or not you feel like a girl or whether or not you feel like a boy. And sometimes you can feel like a little bit of both. And sometimes you want to dress up in ways that our culture says girls dress up, like in pink and in lace and in high heels and sparkles and makeup and
Yeah,
lipstick and nail polish, and sometimes you want to dress up like boys, and what culture says boys they want to do, and that's like jeans and flannel and cozy big sweatshirts, and you just, and it doesn't really matter if you've got a penis or a vulva.
yeah,
It's okay to want any of those things,
yeah,
right? So, and we can do this with toys, right? Like boys who want to play with dolls or girls who want to play with I don't know, like saws and hammers and like all these things. It's like, who cares if they have a penis or a vulva and they want to play with a specific toy or a specific theme? Like, we have to so get over this as a
yes,
culture, right?
yes, I
that's
agree.
one that's one thing, human development.
Yeah.
And the next thing that I think we miss a lot with comprehensive sex ed is relationships. So if you notice, I haven't even gotten to sex yet. Right? So we're talking about comprehensive sexual education. And we have not talked about penises going into vaginas or, dildos, or we haven't talked about anything. We're talking, so let's go to just relationships.
Yeah.
I think the only place that we've done this is in scare tactics of stranger danger.
Mm-hmm.
Usually there's some idea that if you should probably tell kids that nobody should touch their body unless it's mom or dad or a doctor, and only for certain reasons. And so we're getting better at having that conversation with kids as young as 5 or 4 or 6. But that's not relationships. That's like criminal activity, right? So we're helping our kids understand criminal activity. But we need to help kids understand relationships, and sometimes they will from a very early age notice romance, notice mommy and daddy kissing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Notice things on a movie. I mean, we've got, Disney and all the kisses and all the romances and
Yeah.
all the stories, right? That go back, decades. This also includes friendships, right? And how we have good relationships with friends, and what it means to be a good friend, and what it means to be a good listener, and what it means to take turns, and what it means to share, and what it means to, when maybe friends are not as healthy or good, and what you can do about that, right? And of course, as kids get older, this includes romantic relationships, and you can talk about crushes and feelings, and how a platonic friendship might differ from, a romantic feeling and dating, and hopefully not talk about it in a way that diminishes the importance of this and their development, which oftentimes, if you think about both the word crush and the word puppy love, those are minimizing phrases. It's like,
Mm,
oh, you're just having puppy love. It, for a young person that's having their first romance, those are intense feelings. And when we
yeah.
just poo it, when we're like, oh, isn't that cute? Or that's just puppy love, we're not really helping them understand that, yeah, this is you starting to have some feelings that are really big and really important.
I
And
mean, I remember when I was in, gosh, even elementary school, and the the person that I was oohing and awing over maybe didn't feel quite the same way, or maybe they did for a period of time and then they were on to someone else. And I felt like my entire world that I just came crumbling down. I think it was a good opportunity, you know, I think that's a good opportunity for us to step into what you're just saying, which is having communication with our kids at that point. Because it's the biggest in their world, that is the biggest thing that's going on. And they're like, what is this grieving? I don't even know how to grieve. Why am I grieving? The mind can't even wrap itself around it. And I remember with my own daughter and son having conversations with my spouse about, you know, he's like, why is this a big deal? Like, they're in 8th grade. I'm like, it is their entire world. you know, it's
Right.
falling apart. So yeah, I agree. Having these conversations are important.
Yeah. And if you minimize their feelings when they're younger, why are they going to feel like their feelings are legitimate when they're older? Right? And so much of the feelings that we have around emotional intelligence and romance, I think, again, are just not very validated in our culture, right?
Mhm.
I want to just stop for a minute and just share some of our comments. So Stacy Jackson Roberts is listening, which I love her. Anyway, she says, yep, if we don't do developmentally appropriate comprehensive sex education, they will seek info elsewhere. And there's no telling how accurate or safe the information is. Being informed gives children and teens the tools to set boundaries in line with their values and desires. That's, yes. Stacy's as a therapist herself and does really great work and does a lot of education as well and trainings of other therapists. She continues and says, yep, that was me. I knew I was supposed to be a girl from earliest memories. And Stacy is a trans woman, and much of the bullying today comes from other parents.
So that's good point.
Not. And then she says, troubling boundaries further internalize messages of shame, particularly when you have no clue what they are really doing. So anyway, and then we're going to talk a little bit about a question that came up about masturbation and showers, but I'm going to save that for a different principle. Okay. All right. So the next comprehensive sex education principle, which kind of goes along with relationships, is personal skills. Personal skills. So are we teaching communication skills? Are we teaching how to negotiate? Are we teaching how to make decisions? Are we teaching how to pick yourself up from mistakes or regrets? You know, again, sometimes in high demand religions, mistakes that have to do with sexuality are like catastrophic. We catastrophize them, right? This is the worst thing you could do. And many times, you know, we're dragging kids into bishop's offices or confessionals, or and we're adding a lot of fear and we're adding a lot of shame to a process that is, for the most part, highly normal and natural. So that's not teaching that's being scared and learning how to keep things secret or keep things inside. No, we want to help people figure out how to be honest and how to make mistakes and how to have certain conversations and how to place a boundary. These are all things that are going to help them be so much more sexually successful.
A question too that I think is coming up as you're reading those things, and I think this is really important to cover, is navigating consent. Like, one of the things that I didn't even realize as an adult was that in between even my marriage, there's consent to be sexual. Like, I just thought it was always my duty to do said whatever. I didn't think that I actually had a voice and had control over my body for years. I didn't believe that. And then I believe it was through one of your teachings, and at some point or another, that you said that. And I literally had to just take a minute and be like, wait, what? And so teaching this to your kids about consent and having those dynamic relationship conversations, like, I'm willing to do this, but I'm not willing to do this. Or when you do this, I don't, before they do it. Or, you know, I, people are coming in for kisses, and it's like, did you ask if you could come in for a kiss? Or now I'm just left in this awkward, like, in high school, I had a guy come in for a kiss, and I wasn't even prepared for it. And so I gave him the cheek, because I was like, well, what are you doing? And then when we went back, it was after a high school dance, and then we went back to school the following week, and there were rumors flying around school about how I had given him oral sex, and that was indeed not the case.
Mm.
But his ego was hurt because I had given him the cheek. He didn't even know what to do with that. So it's like, are we teaching our children how to have those, the consent talk? How do you do that? I mean,
Yeah, this is so, I mean, we could probably talk 3 hours about this topic alone. And I know I have in the past talked about consent, but I think for me, I think where this really begins again is with a wrong paradigm of sexuality. When the paradigm of human sexuality is is primarily about having sex with another person that you're married to, right? From a heterosexual kind of perspective, then the paradigm is all about my sexuality is about keeping my marriage happy. My sexuality is about keeping my spouse happy. My sexuality is about this negotiation that, has to happen because otherwise, in some cultures, if you don't have intercourse, you're not even considered married until the penis, penetrates the vagina, right? And so these are a lot of the what I call ownership models of sexuality. We romanticize them in this culture. Right? How many times have you heard a song where it says, I belong to you and you belong to me, and it sounds so beautiful? That is not really beautiful language. That is territorial language. And when you're saying you belong to me, several things are happening there. It's like, well, if you belong to me, then part of your job is to keep me comfortable.
mm,
And when you have two people with different power dynamics, depending on the relationship, depending on the gender, depending on the biological sex, depending on who maybe gets to be considered more righteous in this kind of community, then basically your job is to tamper with your sexuality so that it can fit into my comfort box. Instead of starting out with what I call a differentiation model of sexuality, which is more about my sexuality belongs to me. Nobody's entitled to it. Doesn't matter what our relationship status is. Doesn't matter if we've been married or if we're on the second date or if you bought me a lobster dinner or whatever that nobody's entitled to my sexuality. And when I decide how I want to share my sexuality, then really some beautiful, wonderful, even magical things can happen with another person. And then right from the start, you can see how one builds ego resilience because it's like, well, if I am in charge of mine, that automatically means you're in charge of yours. And although I may ask you things or be interested in things or want to negotiate things with you, I get it that you may not say yes to me because it belongs to you and mine belongs to me. And things that you may ask, I may be interested in, and things that you ask, I may not be interested in. So right from the start, your ego resilience is more robust. When you start with this space of like, oh, but I belong to you, and so I either need to keep you happy or I need to play that role, or I need to either become more sexual or less sexual in order to keep you comfortable. Now we're off to fragile sexual ego. And
yeah,
we're also like this boy that you dated, he couldn't handle the no, right? Because again, we're not teaching these concepts in public school systems. I mean, we're teaching like what the uterus looks like and what the sperm looks like, but we're not teaching these relational things.
yeah,
And so because we have so much toxic masculinity about boys needing to prove themselves that they're sexually aggressive or experienced or can quote unquote get laid in order to have some sort of social clout in our culture, then it's very scary, not just from the perspective that you said, no, I don't want to kiss you, but now what's everybody else going to say and think about that
yeah,
I was either quote unquote rejected or denied or whatever language that is. And that just sets us all up for failure, right? That kind of
totally.
shitty stuff that
So,
happens.
and I absolutely agree with you 100%. So if you're a parent and you've experienced this kind of culture that we've been talking about, and now you want to break the generational chain that we're seeing, and maybe you've stepped outside of a high demand religion and you want to be able to do what we've just been talking about and tell your kids, boy or girl, about what we just talked about. I mean, what's something that you feel is a good way to approach that conversation in regards to this topic right here that we're talking about, and
Yeah.
in regards
Yeah.
to consent and give and take and all that?
Yeah, well, I'm constantly, telling all of my kids that their bodies belong to them. And I started that from a very early age, like even with wrestling or tickling or hugging, it's like, as I've got three sons, and they're boys and they love to wrestle and jump on each other and play football and all kind of those kind of more stereotypical boy things. And that's fine until somebody says no, or until somebody's hurting or somebody's annoyed and somebody wants to stop. And then typically they'll keep going. And a lot of times they'll say to me things like, well, mom, that's what siblings do. They bother each other. And I'm like, not in this house.
Mm,
Not in this house.
yeah,
That may be what everybody else is saying, but in this house we respect boundaries.
yeah,
Right. And that's something that they're probably sick of hearing me say, but that's something I've said many, many times, right?
yeah,
Not in this house. Even the teasing and the things that people are just supposed to feel like, oh yeah, it's normal to be teased, and I just need to laugh at myself. And I'm like, not in this house. That's not emotional intelligence.
yeah.
That's being hurtful and getting away with it. And then somebody has to pretend they're not hurt so that they can laugh instead of
Mhm.
really being honest about our feelings and how that doesn't feel good, right?
Yeah,
Some of you have more power than the others. So all the oldest ones of mine have gotten a lot of those talks. You have more power. You're 2 years older. You're bigger. You're stronger. You have more intelligence, not because your IQ is better, but because you're a sixth grader instead of a fourth grader. You
yeah.
have more responsibility when you have power.
So you would suggest, if I'm hearing you correctly, one of the main important things is letting people know that they have their own autonomy over their bodies and being able to advocate for themselves.
That's right. And
I
and learning how to advocate for others and to be compassionate and to notice, I mean, so much of our body language isn't verbal. So much of the if somebody's, going like this when you come towards them, they don't have to say much. You kind of get the sense that, oh, you're drawing away from me, right? Whereas if somebody's coming openly to you and looking like they're wanting to hug you, I mean, so it's
you
both,
know
it's,
one of the things, and I just want to interject right here because this was a very pivotal moment for me as a parent. Growing up, like my kids, they would do that. Like let's say I'd say, hey, go hug Uncle so and so, or go hug Aunt so, and I kind of give them the let's go, push along, and they're doing that. They're like, they don't want to go, and I'm pushing them. Come on now, don't be mean. Come on, we don't want to hurt Uncle or Aunt so and so, and then you kind of push them into their arms. And it was a big moment of an epiphany for me that what I was doing was taking away my children's, what we were just talking about. I don't feel comfortable in this, and now I can't advocate for myself because if I do, I'm hurting someone's feelings, and
yeah.
so if for now, if I come in and I want to hug either an adult, child, person, and I notice that their body is leaning, they don't want that. I'm like, well, this person feels uncomfortable. It's time for me to step back. And
Mhm.
it's not an ego thing. It's that that person is maybe still learning how to advocate for themselves. I think that's a really important
Yeah, it's always
topic.
fascinating to me how, as parents and as a general culture, we're so much more concerned about 75-year-old grandma's feelings, who I hope she's a grown-ass woman by now, right? And can handle some of her own emotional regulation. And if she
Yeah.
can't, maybe she needs to see a therapist.
All right.
Versus this 5-year-old, right? Or 7-year-old who's uncomfortable, but we're expecting that young kid who is not fully cooked at all to somehow have the emotional regulation to handle whether or not they want to hug somebody, right?
Yeah.
So and so I've been very, very clear with my kids that that's, their body is theirs and they can hug or not hug. But sometimes I see other people telling their kids to, go hug Aunt Natasha, right? Or go hug, and I can see that hesitation. And so I'll right away, I'll be like, oh, you don't have to hug me. That's okay. Why don't we shake hands, right? Because I can tell their parents are like
Mhm.
pushing it, right? And
Yeah.
so I just try to model Like, yeah, what, you can shake my hand, or it's fine. I get it, I think you're cool regardless if you hug me or not, right? And so I just, because it's my job as the 50
Mm.
something year old to help a 7-year old versus the other way around,
And
right?
I think it helps too, like going back to the sex talk, I think it helps too for people, especially when you can advocate for yourself little growing up. I mean, here comes sexual feelings, here comes desires. If you could advocate for yourself and had people respect those boundaries, like you, like, oh, let's just high five, like, or whatever. There's no need to, we don't need to touch or whatever. To be able to advocate for yourself at a young age, um, and then moving into when you're having sexual, a partner that you want to have boundaries with, where you can have that open dialogue of, here's what I'm comfortable with and here's what I'm not comfortable with. Here is what I like, here's what I don't like, because you've been doing it. And I think, for parents like myself who maybe were involved for a little bit longer within the LDS church, then moving out of it, we're kind of put on the high speed track of, because maybe I didn't do all those things correctly when my kids were younger, so now I've got to be on the high speed track of having those conversations and moving it forward and saying you need to advocate for yourself and you need to do all these things. And I think um yeah, just having those dialogues, and that means a lot to hear you say that, because I think self advocacy it's getting better, but I think there's a lot of room to grow.
Yeah, oh yeah, we've got a lot of room to grow for sure. And I think it's part of this too. I mean, for example, sometimes I mean, again, like Stacy Jackson Roberts says, consent is an ongoing process throughout the interaction. Checking in can be very sexy, right? So just like it's fun to ask your friends, hey, you want to play He-Man, right? Or you want to play this? It's like it's not cool if you didn't guess what game you wanted to all play. It's fun to kind of think about ideas and say, hey, do you want to do this or that? Or what games do we want to play? How do we want to interact? Or also to, in a more sensual way, that sometimes, so I think we have this idea that it's only sensual if it's like in the movies, back in the 80s, right, with the stretch of the arm, and I'm gonna like, and it's always heterosexual too, right? Like it's always this man or this young boy who's like stretching his arm across her shoulders while they're watching a movie, and she's like there wondering what's gonna happen.
Eating
So
popcorn.
yeah, and so she plays this very passive role of just, well, something is being done to me, and I guess I need to figure out whether or not it's okay for something to be done to me. She's never usually the doer.
Yeah.
She's not playing that role. And then, he's going to lean in and kiss her or hold her hand. And those things just happen. And then she's in that awkward space of having to figure out whether or not that's something she wants. Why couldn't we role model, just like, hey, I'm loving sitting by you. Um, would it be okay if I held your hand? Because, I'm just kind of really into the groove with you right now or whatever, right? And it's kind of a flirtatious voice, and it's soft and it's gentle and it's sensual. And that's a skill. That's a
Yeah.
skill, right? And so you can role model this with your kids. You can explain these things to your kids. Like, I know it's goofy right now to hear mom say how I'd hold your hand, in the movies, but this is kind of the stuff that you could say to a date, right?
Yeah.
Instead of and just be very explicit with your kids. Instead of just grabbing somebody's hand or taking a first kiss, what are some ways we could practice, and then you can, go throw up in the bathroom because mom made you practice what to say when you're
Hold
gonna
on my
kiss
hand.
somebody. So kids sometimes are going to resist this kind of thing, or roll their eyes or giggle or laugh, but it's so helpful for them to hear these things from you.
And probably also helpful to do the other side too. Like if you leaned in and really been practicing your sultry voice, and she's like, I'm not ready to hold your hand.
Right.
You don't
That's
have,
right.
this isn't a personal attack on you.
That's exactly right. That's so true, Kenlee. It's not just teaching them how to ask, it's teaching them how to receive a yes and how to receive a no. And to also talk quite a bit about, some of these things are maybes. Some of these
Yeah.
things you're doing for
Yeah.
the first time, and maybe part of you wants to try this thing, and maybe part of you is still a little hesitant. And so, you can lean into that. You can try something, but then if you get uncomfortable, now your hand is sweaty and you've been holding it for 10 minutes, you can let go, or you can say, "Hey, thanks, that was really lovely, but I'm gonna take my hand back for a minute," right? Or something. And to teach that resilience, if somebody says no to you, even though it can be a little worrisome or hurtful, or maybe feel a little, tense or anxious, that's okay. And that they're doing you a favor because they're being honest with you. They're
Yeah.
being honest with you. And so what can you say to that? You can say, "Oh, thanks for being honest with me. Yeah, thanks for letting me know how you're, that what you're comfortable with. Thanks for that."
Yeah.
Not, "Oh, now I'm going to be pouty and now I'm going to leave the movie, or now we're not going to talk on the way home because, you ruined our date," or, this
You
is
led me on, and then you denied me. And blah, blah, blah.
right,
Yeah.
right. So, and I think this goes, I mean, these days, I think people who, identify as girls are being more aggressive, are maybe asking out other people for dates, or are maybe making the first move, from like a behavioral perspective. So these are not things that you should teach due to gender or sex. These are things you should teach to all of your kids, right? Because all of your kids may be in a position where they may be the initiator, and all of your kids may be in the position where they're going to be the decider of what to do with that initiation that
Yeah.
occurred. Yeah.
Is as a parent, if you're having these conversations, or if your child, you've taught these things, your child's coming to you, they're expressing all the things that we've talked about. How do you, as a parent, how would you suggest not becoming triggered by our own shit? Like, there's no other way to say that, just like
Oh,
hold
you're
it
going
in
to get
space.
triggered by your own shit.
Great.
I think that's a very lofty goal, Kenlee. Is to
Oh,
never get, and of course, triggered is a strong word. Sometimes trigger is kind of like a trauma response. We're using that word more colloquially, and, but I mean, sometimes it could actually, bring about an actual PTSD trigger, depending on whatever happened to you, whether or not you're dealing with your own sexual traumas or sexual memories or whatever. But a lot of times, more than a trigger, it's discomfort. It's your own
yeah,
anxiety and discomfort, right? That's coming up. And so that this situation is bringing that up for you. And so, yeah, I don't think the goal is to not feel it. I think the goal is to recognize it, know when it's happening, and have some strategies in place to, help soothe yourself through that situation. So whether it's taking a few deep breaths, whether it's pushing pause, and saying, "Kiddo, that's a really good question," or, "I definitely want to talk to you about this, but I just need some time to gather my thoughts," but just make sure you come back to the table. Don't leave a kid hanging, because then they get
totally.
the message pretty clear. Oh, this parent isn't really safe, or their own anxiety is, they can't handle what I'm bringing to the table.
What I'm bringing, yes, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that's a really sound piece of advice, to just take a deep breath for a moment.
Yeah. Okay. So then the next principle I want to touch on is sexual behavior. Sexual behavior. And are we going to, give comprehensive sexual education around behavior? And that can include abstinence, that can include safe sex practices, that can include explaining about masturbation, that can include about, explaining how sexuality works even as you get older, and kind of some of the things they can experience or expect to experience as an adult versus in their teens. And so it's kind of like talking for real about what's happening with your body, right?
Yeah,
And bodies usually, for many, many people, expect some type or crave some type of sexual release. And we come from a whole bunch of myths around this, right? That if you give in to that temptation or that desire, that it's just gonna, kind of like the little factory, it's just gonna it's gonna get out of control, and you're gonna be tampering with things that you shouldn't be tampering with, and that you're going to ruin your adult sexuality because you
yeah,
can't have discipline and control. Your body, first of all, it doesn't know if it's Mormon, Jewish, agnostic, atheist, it just doesn't know any of those things. Your body is wanting a sexual release. And this is where it's so unfortunate that we have so many sex negative messages around masturbation, which, by the way, is not a Mormon thing. I mean, that's like a, both a puritanical and even a Victorian era thing that, it's been blamed for acne, it's been blamed for being insane. I mean, people were put into insanity spaces because of masturbation. I mean, it's just so horrific what has happened to the human population around, when you really think about it, just the idea that you can touch your own flipping body, right? Think about babies, will oftentimes rub their ears, they'll suck their thumbs, they'll do all kinds of things, including squeezing their thighs, or even touching their genitals, as self-soothing techniques. And where we ever got the idea that anybody had the right to tell somebody to not touch their own body, especially when we know now through evidence-based research that these are great soothing techniques. It does not get people out of control. And it's actually a very healthy way to regulate your sexual drive, your sexual interests, to go through a sexual developmental process, especially when you're not necessarily prepared to have coupled sexuality, right? But your body, like you, Kenlee, I was touching myself and grinding up against pretty much anything from the time I can remember. I mean, I'm sure I was 3, 4, 2. I'm sure I was one of those kids. I was sexually curious. Some of us come more sexually curious than others. Some I don't know that we know, because I think sometimes we do come sexually curious, but I can imagine a lot of us don't remember the first time that our hands were swiped away from our genitals, or we were told something harsh. And then you get, oh, I'm not supposed to do that. So you need to talk about masturbation. You need to start talking. And so much of our sexual education here in the United States, when it comes to sexual behavior, we go straight to intercourse. That we're talking about safe sex. We're talking about intercourse. We're not talking about Levi 11. We're not talking about grinding. We're not talking about touching people over clothing. We're not talking about touching genitals and erogenous zones. We're not talking about, like masturbating in front of each other, but not necessarily touching the other person. We're not talking about all of these options that are actually quite safe from a sexual health perspective and allow for a lot of exploration and development, because we cannot handle the thought of our children doing any of those things as part of their developmental journey.
Yeah.
And so then we only talk about intercourse. And of course, all the kids who come from these puritanical cultures, purity movement cultures, are doing all those things, many of them that I just talked about. But because it's not intercourse, they get to call themselves virgins, and they get to say, see, I wasn't doing anything that would interfere with my virginity. And by the way, that includes anal sex, which there's nothing wrong with anal sex, but I'm not sure that that's the first thing a person should maybe explore when they don't know anything about sexuality. And there's quite a lot to know about having safe, consensual anal sex, right? And so and so they're doing these things, oftentimes anal sex or oral sex or all these other things, and but very mindful that there's this one kind of sex that keeps us in this category of worthy and virginal and pure. And then we're ignoring all of their other sexual development, instead of normalizing that and going, look, there's so many different options. There's so many different options. And if you don't want to take some of those risks for unwanted pregnancy or certain types of STIs, there are safer ways that you can really enjoy getting to know somebody, exploring some of that sexual development that is normal for you at 14, 15, 16. Usually these are kind of the ages that most people start maybe having some coupled experiences. And you don't even have to worry about intercourse just yet.
Isn't that I'm thinking about my own, having conversations with my own children, but also having the conversations that I had around sex. Yeah, the only thing, it was just always straight from abstinence to sex. There's a whole middle section there of just things that you're missing out that was never talked about.
Right.
And it's interesting because I think, looking back on my younger years, I don't think I even knew that there was anything in between. If I was having a hot, grindy makeout session with somebody, we were just going to go straight sex. There was nothing in between. And had I maybe been a little bit more schooled in sexual health and sexual options and had that open dialogue of everything in between, maybe that would, I would have had maybe a better understanding that just doesn't always have to lead to that. And let's like play that forward in adulthood, right? Like, and you hear older women talk about this quite a bit, like, oh, he's getting handsy, that means we gotta have sex. Like,
Mhm.
maybe he doesn't want to have sex, maybe he wants to play around or whatever, but
Or maybe he does because that's the only thing that you've negotiated as
right.
as an option, right? And now one of you, especially a lower desire partner, is avoiding that type of touch because it always means sex instead of having a variety of ways to feel both emotionally and physically connected
Yeah.
and sensually and sexually aroused, right? And so, yeah, a lot of the work that I do as a sex therapist, quite frankly, is getting people back to what they were doing when they were trying to find all these loopholes. Because I'm like, because now it's become so intercourse centric that
Yeah.
that can become its own pressure cooker. And if things don't go right for whatever reason, now it's a big, again, catastrophe. We catastrophize sexuality so much, right?
I,
Instead of just
I was gonna
normalizing it. Oh my goodness.
one of the things, I mean, as a parent, you wonder, what are the benefits? What are the benefits of having these conversations with my children when they're younger? And sexual health as an adult is a direct outcome to being brave as a parent and having these conversations with your children.
Yeah.
Because if you can remember or remind yourself that there's playfulness that can happen in between and not just the outcome, and then teach that to your children, maybe it takes out the pressure of having to, I'm gonna have this really uncomfortable conversation. Instead, maybe you're just helping them be better adults. Because sometimes we're goal driven
Yeah.
and like, how is this actually gonna benefit my kid if I talk about foreplay? Well,
Right.
they know that
Right.
that's an option. Then as adults, it's not just the outcome where it's just sex and that's all there is in it.
Yeah. Right. And I'm a big fan of people, like, even I mean, I'm still educating so many adults that come into my office, something that I was surprised at learning, I don't know, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. But most female bodied individuals are not going to have an orgasm through penis and vagina intercourse, right? Heterosexual couples. And that is shocking to people. Like, again, even the word foreplay is denoting that the main course is intercourse.
Yeah.
Because foreplay just leads to that, right? Instead of saying, look, there's intercourse play, there's outer or other course play, whatever you want to call it. But I think it's almost beneficial to almost get away from the word foreplay, because
Mm,
it's like, how about just sexual play? And it can include all these other things.
yeah. I like
Sometimes
that.
you may orgasm this way, and sometimes you may orgasm that way. And different people will like different things, and you might like different things at different times. And and to just kind of let people know, your kids know, that intercourse is not the one and only way to have sex and to be sexually active. And this is where, it's interesting as far as just from a statistical standpoint, when they study countries where there is much more comprehensive sexual education, like the Netherlands, and I forget, there's a few European countries that kind of fall under that category. It's not that their kids are being less sexual than us, but here in the United States, we have a much lower age for first debut of intercourse. I think it's about 15, 16 here in the States. And in those countries, it's more like 18, 19 that they're having intercourse for the first time. But that's because they're teaching them all these other ways to
Mhm.
be sexual. Again, it's not necessarily that they're not having sexual play with their first boyfriends and girlfriends and non-binary friends and all those people. It's just that they have more options. And so
Mhm.
therefore, as a result of that, guess what else they don't have? They have a lot of less unwanted pregnancies and they have less STIs. Plus, they do a much better job of educating around safe sex practices anyway. So these things matter. Like
Yeah.
for a country that is primarily still Christian and is having a fit about abortion and is having a fit about sexual assault and is having a fit about so many things, like that really go back to not having a population that is sexually informed. We have not, this whole idea that, well, if we talk about it, we're giving permission, or we should have a zero-sum game on permission, like people should just be not sexual at all and then all the way sexual on this one day they get married. That is not working for us. That is not working. It's not actually giving us the types of sexual health that I think, even if you believe in a deity or believe in some of these values, I think you want to be espousing the type of sexuality that will actually have long-term positive effects for people's long-term relationships, right? So that's we're not doing that. I mean, these formative years, I mean, this is the work I'm doing with thousands of people. Undoing what happened to them in their formative years.
And this is just kind of to tie it all together. I mean, if there's a parent who maybe is listening to this and they want to have these dialogues with their children, teens, maybe they don't know how, maybe they're uncomfortable doing so. What is a resource that you can tell them to go to help either bring their kid to bring themselves to? What's a resource?
Well, like I just said, I mean, I'm getting a lot of this information from just a Planned Parenthood one page. Of course, I've added a lot to it. I think that the Unitarian Church has a program called Our Whole Lives. That is an excellent program that was developed by sexual educators, and anybody can sign up for it. You can sign your kids up for it, and it's from kindergarten to college. I believe that they offer different levels of developmentally appropriate sexual education. There's, you can always go to my website, natashahelfer.com, because I have a resources page and a library page. So I have like books that I would recommend for, kids age 8 to 12. And then of course, books that are recommended for teenagers. And it mean, and read them yourself. Read them yourself first.
Yeah.
You may not agree with everything in a book. And that's okay. And sometimes a book will give education, but it's not always giving values. And you as a parent have a right to share your own values, right? Like, I think of somebody who might say, well, for me, I think my values are about having sexual activity with somebody that I'm committed with, and have a loyal relationship with. And that's what I would like to instill in you, my kiddo. And that's great. I think it's good to teach your values. At the same time, you can't guarantee that your kids will have your same values. And even when your kids do have your same values, that doesn't mean that all of their behavior will always follow their values.
Right.
I mean, most of my kids have been taught the value of honesty and to not lie to me. How many of my kids have lied to me? All of them.
Right.
Right. So even though I think in general, they're fairly honest, trustworthy kids, they have played around with that limit. And when am I going to tell mom something? And when am I scared to tell mom something? And so they're playing around with their values of honesty while making some mistakes or making some decisions that I wouldn't agree with. And I don't want those mistakes or that growth process to cause a catastrophe for them, because I haven't prepared them for the reality that mom will maybe be a little bit upset when you've been dishonest with me, but she's probably not going to implode and ground you for 5 months straight, right? So, I mean, this is something we can work through. And this is what we're failing to do with sexuality, right? We're making it this zero-sum game. And even if kids do have those values, they may still, at times for a variety of very complicated reasons, still be sexual. Whether they feel pressured, whether they feel, whether they have a non-consensual experience, whether they have a freeze response during a non-consensual experience. And if they are not more equipped and prepared, they're going to have a harder time, right, in those kinds of moments. So yeah, lots of resources. I kind of love this comment from, if I can find it, Stacy Jackson Roberts. You're making a lot of comments, and now I can't find the one I wanted to watch. To read. But she talked about a experience with a father. She talked about an example of a father who was starting to practice these conversations with his infant son,
Oh,
and, and knowing that his infant son is probably not going to remember, but just to practice it,
practice it. Yes.
practice the language, right?
Yeah.
So you can imagine holding your little son and going, "You have a penis, right? And your penis is going to get erect one day." And and so and your baby's like, "Lolly la." It doesn't really
Oh,
matter what
whatever.
you're
Yeah.
saying. So I think that was kind of a clever idea. All right, the last principle I want to talk about is actually two more. So one, we talked about sexual behavior. The next one would be sexual health. And again, this is a lot of what they get at school, right? So sexually transmitted infections, contraception, and pregnancy. But I would really hope that at home we're not teaching, again, these tools in kind of catastrophic or fear-mongering ways. The reality is that sexually transmitted infections are very common. High amounts of people have them in our culture. We don't talk about this enough. So again, it's not the end of the world if that happens. Most of them are very treatable. In fact, the only times they're not treatable is usually when they're ignored and they become diseases, right?
I do believe that is the slideshow that they showed me in high school was the one that had gone untreated for 75 years. And that's the picture they threw up there and told me that was, chlamydia.
Right,
It
right.
was like,
Just so, I mean, most of these STIs are treated very easily with antibiotics or, other things. I mean, there are more serious ones, of course, like HIV. And even those are very, manageable, not curable. But again, can we give comprehensive education instead of just fear-based education? We want to talk about pregnancy and unwanted pregnancy and how to, I think I tell my kids all the time, like, whether or not I agree that you're having sexual activity, please use two forms of birth control, right? While you're not prepared to have a baby, So,
right.
and also depends, is your partner using a form of birth control? Can you trust that partner? If you're maybe with a partner who takes birth control pills, how do you know if they take them correctly? So, what are you doing on your end? And this, I've told my sons, of course, like this idea that you're not going to wear a condom because somehow it takes a small, tiny percentage of pleasure away from you. It's just not going to fly, right? Like that's not being very mature, and we can do all kinds of things. I also talk to them quite a bit about how a lot of times that the labor of birth control is often placed on female bodies, right? And so what are they going to do as men? All of my boys are oriented as men and also as heterosexual, as far as I know so far. So what are they going to do to alleviate that burden or to participate in that burden, right? So I think those are important things to talk about with all your kids. Who's doing the labor of birth control? And then the last principle is society and culture. And boy, could we talk about this forever. This is why the conversations can be ongoing. So this is gender roles, this is diversity, this is how sexuality shows up in the media. Now it's like AI. How's AI interacting with sexuality, right? So sexually explicit materials that they might, are your kids porn literate, right? That's kind of a term Marty Klein came up with. So do your kids know that things they may watch on sexually explicit materials aren't always very realistic? That it's normal and natural to find curiosity in that or arousal in that, even in themes that might feel off-putting or worrisome. So are we talking about all these things, right? And I talk to my sons about penis size. I talk to them about circumcised penises versus uncircumcised penises. And I don't ever want to hear about anybody being bullied about whether or not their penis is circumcised or not, right? And that kids can be really mean about things like, breast size, butt size, vulvas, penises. I mean, so I'm talking to them about so many things. Maybe they're going to be grumpy. I'm talking to them about so many things over time, but and I probably don't talk to them enough, because a lot of times I also want to give them some space or some privacy, right? So sometimes I'm like, do I talk to them as much as I should? Because I sure talk about it on podcasts a lot, but do I really talk to them about it? So I think that's really important too. So anyway, those are the basic principles, but we can definitely get into more specific questions. There was one here on the podcast, and somebody asked about, let me see, Rhonda asks, what are your thoughts on when parents monitor how long their boys are in the shower to keep them from possibly masturbating in the shower? So first of all, I'm very clear that I think masturbation is a normal part of human sexual development. I do not think that we should be monitoring whether or not our kids are masturbating. And I do think it's part of sexual education to let them know that this is normal behavior. They may do it, they may not do it. It's okay if they're not interested in it, but it's also okay if they are interested in it. And a shower can be a very nice, easy, clean place to masturbate. It's, be thankful if you're the mom changing sheets that maybe the shower has been used as a place to masturbate. Now, I think if there's going to be any monitoring, especially here in Utah, it should be about water consumption. That I think we should be monitoring.
Mine was less about water consumption and more about like if he uses all that hot water, I'm going to be really pissed because now I don't have any.
Right. So we've got water consumption, and we've got the consideration of other people who may also need hot water at a certain time of the day. And so those are okay things, I think, to monitor, right? And I think, again, from an early age, you can tell kids like, it's a private behavior as long as you're doing it privately. And I think you can also say, oftentimes our bodies do create fluids, right? And that just like we create urine, just like we create feces, and we have taught you how to wipe yourself and how to clean up after yourself and how to shower. Those are things that you can do with sexual fluids as well, right? So you can clean up after yourself in those ways, and there's no shame in that. That's just those are normal bodily functions.
Yeah.
Right.
I think there's a and you can tell me if I'm off base here, but I feel like in monitoring shower time, there could be a potential for shame associated with that. And for me, that I wouldn't want to close a door to a potential conversation because they felt shame around it.
Yeah, right. Exactly. The more we talk and normally, can we talk about these things like elbows, knees, and toes?
Right.
I always think it's so funny that that's the song we sing as little kids. It's like head, shoulders, knees, and toes, knees and toes, knees and toes. And I'm like, hold on a minute. We went from head to shoulders and we skipped the entire main part of the body, from breasts and nipples to genitals to, it's like the majority of our erogenous body and the core of our body. We just skip it. We just don't even address it, right?
My mind has now just been expanded, and I know what my week's project is. I'm going to be coming up with a new head, shoulders, knees, and toes. It's going to be like boobs, nipples, vulva.
And balls, vulvas and balls, vulvas and balls. I think those are, really important things. I think we could talk about so many other things. Like Stacy brings up HIV being, undetectable. Oftentimes PrEP is really important to talk to, especially emerging adult kids and older adolescents about. What are we doing if we're educating our gay and lesbian and bisexual kids, right? How are we educating them about relationships? How are we educating them about sexual behaviors? Many of us don't know a lot about that ourselves if we're heterosexual parents, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe this needs to be like a part 2 of how to talk about
right.
how to talk about things that maybe we're not even we don't even know how to talk about, right?
Right. And then there's of course, there's other forms of birth control like the after pill, is that what it's called? The after day pill? There's a new medication too. I'd have to look it up, that helps with if you feel like you had unprotected sex, and it can help against a lot of the basic STIs if you take it the next day, or the day after pill. So yeah, and then you can talk to them about relationships, like they might notice non-monogamy. You can talk about kink. You can talk about vanilla, that there's all different kinds of things. I think the asexual community has really helped us understand different types of attraction. So you can talk to them about the differences between romantic attraction, sexual attraction, intellectual attraction, aesthetic attraction. Just because you're attracted to somebody visually does not necessarily mean you're attracted to them sexually. Some of these things correlate, some of them don't. Sometimes it depends, because I think, again, in Mormon culture, we were like taught, well, if somebody's got a penis and somebody's got a vagina and there's any level of attraction, it's meant to be, and
I'm
maybe it was a friendship attraction, right? Or like a very emotionally intimate attraction, but it wasn't necessarily a sexual attraction. But now you're married and you're expected to make babies together, right? And so
Mhm.
so just letting them know, like, not only how might you show up, but there's a wide variety of how people show up. And these days, what's actually kind of funny and maybe somewhat tragic, but I think we can all chuckle about it, is in these post high demand religious families, guess who's educating who? It's usually the teens and the emerging adults that are educating their parents.
Yeah, it was so funny. My daughter she was having, we were discussing school, and she was like, "Oh yeah," she's showing me about the couple at school. She's like, "Oh yeah, they're polyamorous," and I was like,
Yeah.
"How do you even know what that word is?" Like, at your age, I don't even think the word existed. I'm
Yeah.
sure that it did, but I didn't know it existed. How do you know these things? And yeah, she's schooling me in lots of things. I'm having to challenge myself to keep up with the times. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I
Right.
feel
Right.
awkward, like that parent who's trying to figure out the VCR. Like, what am I doing?
Right.
I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah, it's like pansexual, demisexual, asexual, aromantic. It's like um, there's just so many wonderful terms. And even though, it can be a little bit overwhelming or intimidating or scary, because it's like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start.
Hmm.
It's okay, because all of these different terms, what it means is that there's more and more permission to be different, to not have to fit into certain boxes. And the more permission we have and the more options we have, usually the more we're going to figure out a healthy kind of sexual path forward. And to remember too that, like, sexuality is constantly evolving, right? It's not always as fixed as we think it might be. For some people, it is more fixed, like some people with sexual orientation, but then for others, sexual orientation even is more fluid, right? So it's a continual journey, it's a constant conversation. And I don't know if there were any questions that we missed from maybe those first questions that you wanted to bring up, Kenlee, but otherwise I think we're kind of nearing the end.
No, I think that's it. I think we covered everything that was the questions. I would love to just, I guess, do the plug again to hit your website for some of the books and recommendations that I know you have said would be helpful for teens, but also to challenge parents to, like you said, read them themselves, right? Not just turn it over to somebody else to school yourself. I think these are really, really excellent messages.
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot of great books out there to start educating yourselves on. Hopefully they can be fun books to read. I mean, I think for me it is fun to read about sex and sexuality, and
Yeah.
to learn new terms or to learn new concepts, or just a lot of times in these books they just have stories and it's kind of fun to read, what how
Be,
it,
be curious,
yeah,
right?
be curious.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I also have a standalone webinar. I probably need to go back and look at it, because I think I developed it about 4 or 5 years ago. But there's a ten series webinar that I have developed for sexual education of kids. So it's probably a little bit outdated now, because a lot has happened in the sex therapy field in 4 years. So I need
I
to go back and probably redo it. But that's a good start, and it's not horribly expensive to, get that from me. There's other people too that offer good sexual education. There's I always like to mention the Birds and Bees podcast by Braxton Dutson. He does a great job bringing on topics specifically about sexual education on his podcast. So there's a lot of good resources out there.
I think that's great. Maybe we can link some of that stuff when we do the podcast, because I think it would be really great for us to and when I say us, I mean parents,
Yeah.
to have some sort of resources just to school ourselves into these conversations so that I don't feel like I'm trying to play catch up when my kids are talking to me.
Yeah. And it's also okay, right? Like if your kids are coming at you with stuff that you don't know, we don't have to always feel like we're the authorities and I've got to pretend I know. It's like, oh, well, that's cool. Like, tell me about that. What does that mean? I didn't grow up with
Yeah,
these kinds of words, and so that's exciting that you know more than I do and have them explain things to you and then that can help them feel important and like, I mean, kids always like to feel like they're schooling their parents on something. So that's okay,
true, true.
yeah.
I love that. I love the messages tonight. Well, thank you, Natasha.
Hey,
You're awesome.
everybody. Let's go forth. Let's educate our kids. let's let's role model good behavior, right? So whether you have your own kids or whether you interact with other people's kids, there's so many things that you can do to role model consent, to role model just the normativity of sexuality, to not be freaked out by questions. And even if you are freaked out, figure out how to breathe it out and we can do this. We can do this. So we can definitely do it. And then, we're also reparenting ourselves in many ways. So it's really wonderful, beautiful work. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the no, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade